What if the history we were taught was never the whole story? What if the textbooks, the timelines, the neat progressions from primitive to complex, from simple to sophisticated, were always only partial accounts, fragments of a much larger truth that the earth itself has been quietly holding in trust, waiting for us to ask better questions? 7 sites, 7 places scattered across the face of this planet, separated by oceans and deserts and thousands of years. Places that, according to everything we thought we knew about the development of human civilization, should not exist, should not have been built, should not have required the precision they demonstrate, the coordination they demanded, the knowledge they encoded. And yet there they are, carved into limestone ridges and volcanic rock, rising from jungle floors and desert plains, aligned to stars with an accuracy that modern engineers still find remarkable. Waiting. The stones have always been patient. They were patient when the empires rose around them. They were patient when the empires fell. They were patient through the long centuries when no one came to look, when the jungle swallowed them whole, when the desert drifted over them, when the ocean rose and the forest thickened and the world above them changed beyond recognition. They will be patient long after we are gone, but tonight, in this quiet hour, we are going to them. We are going to sit with them in the dark and ask the question that the official history has always struggled to answer. Who built these places, and what did they know that we have forgotten? Before we go any further into the archive tonight, if you find yourself drawn to these kinds of questions, to the places where the official record goes quiet and something stranger and older begins to speak, consider subscribing to the channel. Every week, we open another file from the archive, another story that history tried to bury. And if you are listening right now in the dark, I want to know where you are. Drop a comment with your location and the time. There is something quietly extraordinary about the idea of people spread across the globe, in different time zones, under different skies, all drawn to the same ancient mysteries in the same still hours. That community is real, and it matters. Now, settle in. You do not need to be anywhere else tonight. Let the day go. The stones will carry us from here. There is a version of human history that most of us absorbed without quite realizing we were absorbing it. It goes something like this. For most of our existence, human beings were simple, nomadic, reactive. We followed the herds and gathered what the land offered and built nothing that lasted because we had neither the time nor the cognitive architecture for lasting things. Then, roughly 10,000 years ago, something changed. We learned to farm. We settled down. We built villages, then towns, then cities. We developed writing and mathematics and astronomy and architecture. We went in the comfortable shorthand of 1,000 textbooks, from primitive to civilized, from scattered to organized, from forgetting to remembering. It is a tidy story. It has the satisfying shape of progress, of ascent, of a species pulling itself upward by its own ingenuity. And it is, in its broad outlines, not entirely wrong. Agriculture did change everything. Cities did emerge from settled communities. Writing did transform the way knowledge accumulated and survived. But here is what the tidy story leaves out. It leaves out the sites that do not fit, the structures that predate the timeline, the alignments that require knowledge the builders were not supposed to have. the stones that were moved in ways we cannot fully replicate today, the faces carved into pillars that stare out across 11,000 years with an expression that looks uncomfortably like self-awareness. The tidy story leaves out the possibility, increasingly supported by evidence, that civilization as we understand it may not have been invented once in a single place, in a single moment of agricultural awakening. It may have been invented and lost and partially recovered and lost again in cycles so long and so quiet that we have mistaken the recovery for the origin. And perhaps that is the most unsettling implication of all. Not that someone is hiding the truth from us, not that there is a conspiracy of silence among the world's archaeologists, but simply that the framework we use to understand the past is too small, that the window we are looking through is not large enough to contain what actually happened, that every time we find a site that should not exist, what we are really finding is evidence that the window needs to be wider, the timeline longer, the story more complicated and more human than the version we were given. 7 sites. Let us begin. The first site sits on a limestone ridge in southeastern Turkey, in a landscape that is dry and rolling now, but was once something entirely different. The Taksh Mountains rise gently from the Harran Plain, their flanks covered in scrub and thin soil, and somewhere along those ridges, buried for more than 100 centuries, is a place called Karahan Tepe. You may know its more famous neighbour. Göbekli Tepe, 46 kilometres to the northwest, has received most of the attention since Klaus Schmidt began excavating it in 1995 and revealed to a startled world that hunter-gatherers, people with no pottery, no domesticated animals, no cultivated fields, had somehow organised themselves to carve and erect massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some standing over 5 meters tall and weighing 10 to 20 tons, arranged in great circular enclosures decorated with extraordinary animal carvings. Göbekli Tepe dates to approximately 9,600 BCE, making it the oldest known megalithic complex on Earth. Older than Stonehenge by 6,000 years, older than the Great Pyramids by 7,000. And then there is Karahan Tepe, which may be older still, or at least equally ancient, and which in some ways is stranger. A Turkish archaeologist named Bahattin Çelik found it in 1997 during a survey of the region. What he discovered, protruding from the thin soil, were the tops of T-shaped stone pillars. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, scattered across a hilltop covering roughly 10 hectares. Systematic excavation did not begin until 2019 under Professor Necmi Caral of Istanbul University. And what has emerged from that excavation is something that challenges the Göbekli Tepe narrative, even as it confirms it. Consider what has been found in just 5% of the site. 5%. That is the fraction that has been excavated so far. The rest waits beneath the limestone ridge, patient as only stone can be patient. Whatever lies in the remaining 95% of Karahan Tepe is still pressed against the earth, still breathing in the dark beneath centuries of accumulated soil and silence, still waiting for the question that will bring it into the light. That thought alone, the thought of what is still down there, is worth sitting with for a moment before we continue. What that 5% has revealed is a complex of interlinked enclosures, some carved directly into the bedrock of the ridge, others constructed with external masonry walls, some combining both techniques in ways that suggest a long history of construction, modification, and reuse. The enclosures vary dramatically in size and apparent function. Some are intimate, almost claustrophobic, carved deep into the rock. Others are expansive, open to the sky, with benches running around the perimeter, as though designed for groups of people to sit and observe something at the center. Imagine sitting on one of those stone benches on a clear autumn night 11,000 years ago. The plain below the ridge is silver in the moonlight, the seasonal wetlands catching the light where the rivers have spread across the flat ground. The air smells of wild grass and damp stone, and the faint smoke of a fire somewhere below. And at the center of the enclosure, the T-shaped pillar stands in the dark, its carved surfaces barely visible, the animals etched into its flanks, seeming to move when the firelight catches them at the right angle. You are not alone. There are others on the benches around you. Something is happening here, something that requires the gathering of people, the arrangement of stone, the deliberate creation of a space set apart from the ordinary world. Something that required months, perhaps years, of organized labor to build. Something worth building. But here is what makes Karahan Tepe different from Göbekli Tepe in the most fundamental way. If Göbekli Tepe is a place of animals, Karahan Tepe is a place of humans. The most striking evidence came in September of 2023, when archaeologists uncovered a seated male figure carved from limestone, standing 2.3 meters tall. The figure is naked. His ribs are visible, individually carved as deep, incised lines running down his torso. His spine is articulated. His hands grasp his phallus, which is prominently displayed. Around his neck is a V-shaped collar. This is not abstract art. This is not symbolic geometry. This is a specific body, rendered with anatomical attention that implies not just skill, but intention. Someone wanted this particular body to be remembered. Someone looked at a block of limestone and saw a person inside it, and spent days or weeks coaxing that person out with stone tools and patience, and whatever it is that drives a human being to make a likeness of another human being and place it at the center of a sacred space. And then, in October of 2025, the face, a human face carved into the flat top of a T-shaped pillar, deep-set eyes beneath a heavy brow, a sharp jawline, a broad nose, not a symbol, not a pattern, a portrait, a person from the Neolithic age carving themselves into stone in an act of self-expression so old it predates every written language, every kingdom, every city that has ever existed. The face was found in a room that still contained grinding stones, a room where someone lived, where someone ate, where someone looked at this pillar every morning and saw a face they recognized. Let that settle for a moment. A face carved into stone in a room where someone ground their grain and cooked their food and slept and woke and went about the ordinary business of being alive 11,000 years ago. The face was not in a temple or a palace or a burial chamber. It was in a room, a domestic space, a lived space, which means that whatever the face represented, whatever meaning it carried, that meaning was not reserved for special occasions or ceremonial moments. It was part of the texture of daily life. The sacred and the ordinary were not separated by walls or schedules. They inhabited the same room. Here, is what the existence of Karahan Tepe asks us to reconsider. The site covers 10 hectares. The quarrying zones where the pillars were carved cover another 5. The effort required to carve a single T-shaped pillar from limestone bedrock using nothing but stone tools would have been immense. To carve hundreds of them, to move them into position, to build the enclosures around them, to organize the labor, to sustain the workers, to plan the layout across generations, this required something that hunter-gatherer societies were not supposed to have. Organization, hierarchy, a reason to build that extended beyond the immediate needs of survival. And yet the people who built Karahan Tepe had no pottery, no domesticated animals, no cultivated fields. They were hunters and gatherers living off wild grain and wild game in a landscape that was, to be fair, far richer than it is today. The geological evidence tells us that this region, during the last ice age and the long warming that followed, was wet, forested, alive with oryx and gazelle and wild boar and the Anatolian leopard, a world of abundance that required no agriculture to sustain a population large enough to build on this scale, which raises a question that the official timeline has never quite resolved. Did agriculture produce civilization? Or did something else, something we might call the impulse toward monument, toward permanence, toward the carving of faces into stone, produce both agriculture and civilization as consequences of a deeper human need? Klaus Schmidt, who spent his career excavating Göbekli Tepe, believed that the temple came before the village, that the desire to build sacred spaces preceded and perhaps even drove the development of settled life and agriculture. The monument was not the product of civilization. The monument was its seed. And if that is true, then everything we thought we understood about the sequence of human development needs to be rearranged, not discarded, rearranged. The pieces are the same, but the order is different, and the order changes everything. Karahan Tepe seems to confirm this, and it is only the first of our 7 sites. If this is the kind of question that keeps you awake, consider liking the video. It helps the archive reach others who are asking the same things in the dark. The second site requires us to travel south and east, across the Arabian Peninsula, to a place that for most of human history has been one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. The Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, the largest continuous sand desert in the world, a place of extreme heat, extreme aridity, virtually no permanent water sources, and almost no human habitation for the past several thousand years. And yet beneath the sands of the Arabian Peninsula and in the regions surrounding the empty quarter, evidence has accumulated over the past 2 decades of a civilization, or perhaps more accurately, a network of interconnected communities that flourished during a period when Arabia was not a desert at all. The Arabian humid period, sometimes called the Green Arabia hypothesis, refers to a climatic interval between approximately 11,000 and 5,000 years ago, during which the monsoon system extended much further north than it does today, bringing seasonal rains to regions that are now bone dry. During this period, the Arabian Peninsula was a landscape of grasslands, shallow lakes, river systems, and seasonal wetlands. Hippos lived in what is now Saudi Arabia. Cattle were herded across what is now the empty quarter. And people, many people, built structures, carved petroglyphs, and left behind traces of a sophisticated material culture that has only recently begun to receive serious archaeological attention. Imagine the Arabian Peninsula as it was 8,000 years ago, not the shimmering heat and the empty dunes of the modern imagination, but a landscape of waving grass and standing water, of cattle moving in slow herds across plains that catch the afternoon light, of birds in the reed beds along the seasonal rivers, of children playing near the edge of a shallow lake that will still be there in the morning. A world so different from the Arabia of today that if you were set down in it without knowing where you were, you would not recognize it as the same place. The transformation from that green world to the desert that exists now happened gradually, over millennia, as the monsoon retreated and the rains grew less frequent and the lakes shrank and the rivers narrowed and finally vanished. But for the people who lived through the early stages of that transformation, it must have been a slow catastrophe, a world dying in slow motion, an abundance becoming scarcity, generation by generation, with no clear beginning and no clear end. Among the most remarkable discoveries from this period is a site in the Haima region of southwestern Saudi Arabia, which contains one of the largest concentrations of rock art in the world. More than 14,000 inscriptions and images carved into the dark basalt rocks of a landscape that preserves them with extraordinary clarity. The images span thousands of years, from the earliest Neolithic period through the Islamic era. But the oldest among them depict a world utterly unlike the Arabia of today. Cattle in enormous herds, horses, camels rendered with a naturalism that implies not just observation, but intimacy. Human figures in postures of ceremony and dance. And among the oldest images, geometric patterns and symbols that recur across the ancient world with a frequency that is difficult to explain as coincidence. But the rock art, extraordinary as it is not the most unsettling discovery from this region. That distinction belongs to the Mustatils, first documented from the air in the 1970s, but only recently subjected to systematic ground survey. Mustatils are rectangular stone enclosures found across northwestern Saudi Arabia in numbers that are, when you understand their scale and distribution, almost incomprehensible. More than 1,600 have been identified so far. They range in size from tens of meters to over 600 meters in length. They are built from low stone walls, sometimes just a single course of stones, sometimes more substantial, and they are oriented with a consistent internal logic. A broad, rectangular courtyard, a narrow entrance at one end, a small chamber at the other. The most recent excavations, conducted by the Royal Commission for Al-Ula in partnership with the University of Western Australia, have confirmed that the Mustatils date to approximately 7,000 years ago, making them among the oldest ritual monuments in the world. Older than the great stone circles of Europe. Older than the pyramids, and they were built across a landscape that stretched hundreds of kilometers, implying not a single community, but a network of communities sharing a common ceremonial tradition. Inside the chambers, at the far end of the enclosures, excavators have found animal bones, cattle, gazelle, and in some cases the bones of animals that had been killed and placed there deliberately, in what appears to be a form of offering. The Mustatils were not houses. They were not defensive structures. They were places of ritual, aligned with the landscape, distributed across a territory so vast that the coordination required to maintain a shared tradition across it implies a level of social organization that the official timeline of Arabian prehistory has not previously accommodated. Here is what makes this significant in the context of our 7 sites. The Mustatils were built during the Arabian humid period, when the landscape was rich enough to support large populations. They were built before writing, before cities, before the agricultural civilizations of Mesopotamia had fully consolidated. And they were built with a consistency of design across a vast geographic area that suggests something we rarely attribute to pre-urban societies: a shared cosmology, a shared ritual practice, a network of meaning that stretched across the landscape and bound communities together across distances that would have required days or weeks of travel. And then the rains stopped. The monsoon retreated. The lakes dried. The rivers vanished. The grasslands became desert. And the people who built the Mustatils, who herded their cattle across the green plains of ancient Arabia, who carved their ceremonies into the basalt rocks of Hima, dispersed. Some may have moved north into the Levant and Mesopotamia. Some may have moved south toward the coasts. Some may have stayed as long as they could, watching the world dry around them, carrying their knowledge in their memory, because the landscape that had given that knowledge its context was slowly ceasing to exist. What they left behind is a landscape of monuments built by a civilization that the history books have only just begun to acknowledge existed. More than 1,600 Mustatils, stretching across hundreds of kilometers of what is now one of the most remote and inaccessible regions on Earth, waiting beneath the desert sun for someone to ask what they are and why they were built. The third site takes us west to the Nile Valley, but not to the Egypt you are thinking of, not to Giza, not to Luxor, not to the familiar monuments of the pharaonic civilization. We are going further back to a place in the western desert of Egypt called Nabta Playa, and to a discovery that quietly, without much fanfare, rewrote the prehistory of northeastern Africa. Nabta Playa is a dry lake basin in the Nubian desert, roughly 100 kilometers west of Abu Simbel, in a region that today receives almost no rainfall and supports almost no life. But between approximately 11,000 and 5,000 years ago, during the same African humid period that greened the Arabian Peninsula, Nabta Playa was a seasonal lake, filling with water each summer from monsoon rains and drawing human populations to its shores. The people who came to Nabta Playa were, like the builders of Karahan Tepe and the Mustatils, pre-agricultural. They were cattle herders, moving seasonally with their animals, camping at the lake during the wet season and dispersing during the dry. And yet they built something at Nabta Playa that has no easy explanation within the framework of nomadic pastoralism: a stone circle, several of them, in fact, along with alignments of large upright stones, and a series of underground chambers containing the remains of cattle buried with extraordinary care. But it is the stone circle that has attracted the most attention from researchers, because when astronomer Kim Malaville and anthropologist Fred Wendorf analysed its orientation in the late 1990s, they found something remarkable. The circle at Nabta Playa is aligned to the summer solstice sunrise with a precision that matches or exceeds Stonehenge, which was built roughly 3,000 years later. Certain stones in the circle align with the rising positions of specific stars, including Sirius, Arcturus, Alpha Centauri, and the belt stars of Orion, as they appeared in the sky approximately 6,000 years ago. The people who built this circle knew the sky. They tracked the movements of stars and incorporated that knowledge into stone with an accuracy that required careful, sustained observation over generations. And they did this in the middle of what is now one of the most inhospitable deserts on Earth, at a time when the official history of northeastern Africa suggests that nothing of architectural or astronomical significance was happening anywhere in the region. Consider what this implies. Nabta Playa predates the unification of Egypt by at least 2,000 years. It predates the first dynasties, the first pharaohs, the construction of the earliest mastabas and step pyramids, and yet it demonstrates astronomical knowledge, ceremonial architecture, and a relationship with the sky that the pharaonic civilization would later develop into one of the most sophisticated astronomical traditions in the ancient world. Consider also what it means to track the movements of stars with enough precision to encode them in stone. This is not something you do in a season or a year. This is the work of generations. Someone had to watch the sky long enough to understand that the stars move, not randomly, but in patterns, that those patterns repeat, that the same star rises in the same position on the same morning of the year, year after year, with a reliability that makes it useful for marking time and organizing the activities of a community. And then someone had to communicate that understanding to the next generation, and the generation after that, and the generation after that, until the accumulated knowledge was precise enough to be encoded in stone. That is not the behavior of a people living only in the immediate present. That is the behavior of a people who understood that knowledge could outlast the individual, that the community was a vessel for accumulated understanding, that what you learned in your lifetime was worth passing on. The cattle burials add another layer of complexity. The animals were not simply killed and left. They were interred in stone-lined chambers, covered with stone slabs, arranged with care that implies ritual significance. Cattle were sacred in ancient Egypt, associated with Hathor and with the sky goddess Nut. The Apis bull was one of the most important divine animals in the pharaonic religion. Is it possible that this reverence for cattle, this sacred relationship between human communities and the animals they herded, originated not with the pharaohs, but with the nomadic pastoralists of the Sahara, thousands of years before the first dynasty? The archaeologist Fekri Hassan, who spent decades studying the prehistory of the Nile Valley, argued that the roots of Egyptian civilization extend much deeper into the African interior than the conventional narrative acknowledges. That the people who eventually settled the Nile Valley and built the civilization we call ancient Egypt carried with them a cosmological tradition, an astronomical knowledge, a ceremonial practice that had been developing for millennia in the Sahara, in the landscape of Nabta Playa and the other sites of the African humid period. If Hassan is right, then the pyramids of Giza are not the beginning of something. They are the culmination of something. The latest and most elaborate expression of a tradition of astronomical monument building that stretches back to nomadic cattle herders watching the stars from the shore of a seasonal lake in the western desert. The pharaohs did not invent the sacred relationship between earth and sky. They inherited it. They formalized it. They wrote it down and carved it into temple walls and encoded it in the geometry of the greatest structures the ancient world ever produced. But the impulse was older, the knowledge was older, and the people who first looked up from the shore of Nabta Playa and understood what they were seeing in the sky were, in some essential sense, the first Egyptians, thousands of years before Egypt existed. The fourth site asks us to cross the Atlantic, which is itself a kind of conceptual leap that the history books have always been reluctant to make, because the conventional narrative of human prehistory has tended to treat the Americas as a separate story, a parallel development, a second experiment in civilization that began when the first humans crossed the Bering Land Bridge and slowly, over millennia, populated a new world. But the site of Caral, in the Soup Valley of coastal Peru, does not fit comfortably into that narrative of gradual development, because Caral, which was properly excavated only in the late 1990s and early 2000s by the Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady Solis, is a city, a genuine, planned, architecturally sophisticated city with monumental platform mounds, sunken circular plazas, residential complexes, and a spatial organization that implies urban planning of a kind associated with the great civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt. And Caral dates to approximately 2600 BCE, making it the oldest known city in the Americas and one of the oldest in the world, contemporary with the Old Kingdom of Egypt and the early dynastic period of Mesopotamia. But here is what makes Caral truly extraordinary, what makes it one of our 7 sites that should not exist according to the history we were taught. The people of Caral had no writing, no pottery, no metal tools. They did not cultivate maize, the staple crop that would later become the foundation of Andean civilization. Their economy was based primarily on fish and shellfish from the Pacific coast, traded inland for agricultural products from the valley, and yet they built platform mounds that rise up to 18 meters above the valley floor, requiring an estimated 100,000 cubic meters of fill to construct. They built sunken circular plazas that served as amphitheaters for ceremonial performance. They built residential complexes with multiple rooms, storage facilities, and what appear to be administrative spaces. They maintained a complex economy across a network of interconnected settlements in the Soup Valley. And they did all of this, according to the radiocarbon dates, at the same time that the pharaohs of Egypt were building the first pyramids. The same time. Not inspired by Egypt, not connected to Egypt, not even aware of Egypt. A completely independent development on the other side of the world of monumental architecture, urban planning, and complex social organization, emerging at precisely the moment when the official narrative says civilization was just getting started in the old world. What does this mean? It means that the development of complex society is not a story that happened once, in one place, and then spread. It is a story that happened repeatedly, independently, in multiple places, driven by something in human nature itself, some deep impulse toward organization and monument and the marking of sacred space that does not require a single point of origin. Civilization is not a seed that was planted once and grew outward. It is a capacity latent in the human animal that emerges wherever the conditions allow it to emerge, which means it may have emerged and been extinguished and emerged again, more times than we have yet been able to count. Ruth Shady Solis spent years fighting to get Caral recognized as the significant site it is. The site had been known to archaeologists for decades before her excavations, but it had been dismissed as unimportant, partly because it lacked the ceramic assemblages that archaeologists traditionally use to date and classify sites. Without pottery, the conventional wisdom went, there could be no complex civilization. Caral proved that conventional wisdom wrong. Among the finds at Caral were quippus, the knotted string recording devices that the Inca would later develop into a sophisticated information storage system. The Caral quippus predate the Inca by more than 4,000 years. They are the earliest known examples of this technology in the Americas, and they were found not in a palace or a temple, but in what appears to have been an administrative context, suggesting that Caral had a bureaucracy, a system for recording and managing information, long before writing appeared in the Americas. The architecture of Caral also reveals something about the society that built it. There is no evidence of warfare, no defensive walls, no weapons in the archaeological record, no signs of violent conflict for a city that endured for roughly 1,000 years, from approximately 2,600 to 1,600 BCE. This is remarkable. The conventional narrative of early civilization tends to assume that urban complexity and organized violence go hand in hand, that cities require armies, that power is always ultimately backed by force. Caral suggests an alternative, a city organized around ceremony, trade, and the management of resources, without the militarism that we tend to associate with the ancient world. Perhaps that is why it was forgotten. Perhaps a civilization built on ceremony rather than conquest leaves fewer dramatic traces in the archaeological record, fewer weapons and fortifications and victory monuments, and so it falls below the threshold of what the history books choose to notice. The archive of violence is always easier to read than the archive of peace. I want to pause here and ask you something. As we move through these 7 sites, is there a pattern you are noticing that the archive might have missed? A connection to another ancient text, another forgotten place, another mystery that keeps pulling at you? Leave it in the comments. The archive is built by many hands. The 5th site takes us deeper into the jungle, to a discovery so recent and so vast that its implications have not yet been fully absorbed by the broader culture. We are going to the Amazon basin and to a civilization that should not have been able to exist there at all. The conventional wisdom about the Amazon rainforest, which held sway for most of the 20th century, was that it was a pristine wilderness, a natural landscape essentially unmodified by human activity. The soils of the Amazon, the conventional wisdom held, were too poor, too nutrient depleted to support the large settled populations that dense agriculture requires. The rainforest was a barrier to civilization, not a cradle of it. And then archaeologists began to look more carefully. And what they found beneath the canopy, hidden by centuries of forest growth, was a world that the conventional wisdom had declared impossible. Terra preta, dark earth, scattered across the Amazon basin in patches that can extend for hundreds of hectares. Terra preta is a soil unlike any natural formation in the region. It is rich in charcoal, in organic matter, in ceramic fragments, in bone. It is extraordinarily fertile, capable of sustaining agriculture at a productivity that the surrounding soils cannot approach. And it was made, deliberately, systematically, over generations, by human communities who understood soil chemistry at a level that modern agriculture is only now beginning to appreciate. The people who made terra preta were not primitive forest dwellers scratching subsistence crops from thin soil. They were sophisticated land managers who transformed the ecology of the Amazon over an area that may have encompassed hundreds of thousands of square kilometers, creating a landscape engineered for human habitation and agricultural productivity. They understood that charcoal, incorporated into soil in the right proportions, creates a stable carbon matrix that holds nutrients and moisture and supports microbial communities that make the soil more productive over time, not less. This is not intuitive knowledge. This is the result of systematic experimentation over generations, of observation and refinement, and the careful transmission of agricultural technique across time. Modern soil scientists are studying terra preta today, trying to understand how it was made, because the technique it represents could be transformative for sustainable agriculture in the tropics. We are learning from the Amazonian ancients, and we are only beginning. But the terra preta was only the beginning, because in 2022, using LiDAR technology, airborne laser scanning that can penetrate forest canopy and reveal the topography beneath, archaeologists working in the Llanos de Moyos region of Bolivia and the upper Amazon basin of Brazil began to map a landscape that no one had expected to find. Cities, not the scattered villages and seasonal camps of the conventional narrative, but planned urban centers with streets and plazas and residential districts and ceremonial spaces connected to each other by raised causeways that extended for kilometers across the floodplain, earthworks of extraordinary scale, geometric enclosures, and mounds that cover areas measured in square kilometers. A network of settlements that at its peak may have housed populations in the millions. The LiDAR surveys published between 2022 and 24 have revealed what researchers are now calling the Casaraba culture, a complex urban society that flourished in the Llanos de Moyos between approximately 500 and 1400 BCE, and that represents the most sophisticated pre-Columbian civilization in lowland South America. But the Casarabi culture is only the most recently documented example of Amazonian complexity. Earlier work by the archaeologist Anna Roosevelt at Marijo Island at the mouth of the Amazon revealed a complex chiefdom society dating to roughly 400 CE, with monumental earthworks, elaborate ceramic traditions, and evidence of dense population. Work by Eduardo Neves and his colleagues in the central Amazon has documented pre-Columbian settlements covering hundreds of hectares, with evidence of sustained occupation going back thousands of years. What emerges from all of this is a picture of the Amazon not as a pristine wilderness, but as a cultural landscape, a world shaped by human hands over millennia, engineered for habitation at a scale that rivals the great civilizations of the Old World. A civilization, or rather a network of civilizations, that was effectively erased by the catastrophic population collapse that followed European contact in the 16th century. When the Spanish and Portuguese arrived, they encountered a world already in the process of dying, devastated by the diseases that preceded the colonizers by decades, spreading through trade networks faster than any human being could travel. The cities were emptying. The causeways were being reclaimed by vegetation. The great earthworks were beginning to blur. By the time European explorers penetrated the Amazon interior in the 17th and 18th centuries, the civilization that had built those cities was gone. The forest had moved back in, and the few surviving indigenous communities, reduced to a fraction of their former numbers, living in the margins of what had once been a densely populated landscape, seemed to confirm the conventional wisdom that the Amazon had never supported complex society. But the Earth remembered. The Terra Preta remembered. And now the LIDAR can read what the Earth has been trying to tell us for centuries. There is something profound in that image, a technology we developed to survey terrain from the air, turning its eye downward through the canopy and finding beneath the green surface of the forest the ghost of a civilization that the forest swallowed whole. The cities did not disappear, they were simply covered. And covering is not the same as erasing. The sixth site is the one that has generated the most controversy, the most breathless speculation, and the most determined resistance from the archaeological establishment. It sits beneath the ocean, off the coast of Japan, near the island of Yonaguni, and it is either one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 20th century or an elaborate natural formation that human beings have been misinterpreting for decades. The Yonaguni monument was first brought to widespread attention in 1986 when a local diver named Keihachiro Aratake discovered a series of massive underwater rock formations at a depth of between 5 and 40 meters below the surface, roughly 5 kilometers off the southern coast of Yonaguni Island in the Ryukyu chain. What Aratake found were flat-topped terraces, right-angled corners, straight walls, what appeared to be staircases and columns and carved channels, all cut from solid sandstone and arranged in a pattern that to the human eye looks unmistakably architectural. The debate that has surrounded Yonaguni since its discovery is one of the most instructive arguments in contemporary archaeology, because it reveals how much our interpretation of the past is shaped by our assumptions about what was possible at any given time. The geologist Masaki Kimura of the University of the Ryukyus spent years diving the site and became its most prominent advocate for a human origin. Kimura documented what he described as tool marks, carved channels, and structural features that he argued could not be explained by natural geological processes. He proposed that the monument was a stepped pyramid or ceremonial platform constructed by a sophisticated culture that inhabited the region during the last ice age, when sea levels were much lower and the area around Yonaguni was dry land. The last time the Yonaguni site would have been above sea level was approximately 10 to 12,000 years ago, during the final millennia of the last glacial maximum. If the monument is human-made, it was built by people who lived before the Neolithic Revolution, before agriculture, before the first cities, before everything that the conventional narrative places at the beginning of civilization. It would be, if genuine, the oldest known architectural structure on Earth. The skeptics, and they are many, argue that the features Kimura interprets as architectural are the product of the natural fracturing patterns of sandstone, which tends to split along regular planes and produce right-angled joints, flat surfaces, and linear features that can look deceptively structured. The Japanese government has not recognized the site as an archaeological site, and the mainstream archaeological community has largely withheld judgment, citing the absence of artifacts and the difficulty of distinguishing between natural and human modification in a marine environment. But here is what is not in dispute. The region around Yonaguni was above sea level 10 to 12,000 years ago. People lived in Japan during that period. The Jomon culture, one of the oldest known pottery-making cultures in the world, was present in the Japanese archipelago from at least 14,000 BCE and possibly much earlier. There is no a priori reason why people living in this region during the last ice age could not have modified natural rock formations for ceremonial or practical purposes. And the deeper question the Yonaguni debate raises is this: how much of the human past lies beneath the ocean? Sea levels at the last glacial maximum were roughly 120 meters lower than they are today. The land that was above water during that period, the continental shelves, the coastal plains, the river valleys where most human populations would have concentrated, is now submerged. The archaeology of the last ice age is, for the most part, an archaeology of drowned landscapes. We have found traces of human habitation on the submerged continental shelves of northwestern Europe, in the North Sea and the English Channel, in the region researchers call Doggerland, a vast plain that connected Britain to mainland Europe until it was inundated roughly 8,000 years ago. We have found submerged sites off the coast of India, in the Gulf of Kambat, where sonar surveys have revealed what appear to be geometric structures at a depth of 40 meters, dating to a period when the Gulf was dry land. We have found evidence of human occupation on the now submerged shelves of Southeast Asia, in the region called Sundaland, which was a vast landmass connecting the islands of Indonesia to the Asian mainland during the last ice age, and which was home to a substantial human population before the rising seas claimed it. The ocean is an archive. It is the largest archive we have never properly opened. And Yonaguni, whatever its ultimate origin, is a reminder that the story of human civilization may be far older, far more widely distributed, and far more thoroughly erased by the rising waters of the post-glacial world than the history books have ever been able to accommodate. Every time the tide goes out and the light falls at a certain angle on the submerged rock, the question surfaces again. Not as certainty, just as a question. And questions, as the archive has always maintained, are worth more than premature answers. The seventh site is the one that has been hiding in plain sight, the one that has been studied for 2 centuries and still refuses to yield its deepest secrets, the one that stands on a plateau in the western desert of Egypt, visible from space, visited by millions of tourists every year, and still, after all of that attention, still not fully understood. Giza. But not the Giza you think you know. The Great Pyramid of Khufu is the only surviving wonder of the ancient world. It was built, according to the conventional chronology, around 2560 BCE during the reign of the 4th dynasty Pharaoh Khufu, using a workforce that modern estimates place at somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 people. It contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, with an average weight of 2.5 tons and some blocks weighing as much as 80 tons. It stands 138 meters tall, and when it was completed, it was the tallest structure on Earth, a title it held for nearly 4,000 years. This is the conventional account, and it is not wrong. The pyramid was built during the Old Kingdom. The archaeological evidence for this is substantial. The workers' village has been excavated. The administrative papyri have been found. The graffiti left by the work gangs is still visible inside the structure. But the conventional account does not explain everything. And the things it does not explain are, in the aggregate, deeply strange. Begin with the precision. The base of the Great Pyramid covers 53,000 square meters. The four sides are oriented to true north, south, east, and west with an accuracy of less than 1/10 of 1 degree of arc. The maximum difference in length between the four sides is less than 8 centimeters across a base that extends 230 meters. The corners are almost perfect right angles, deviating from 90 degrees by a maximum of about 3 minutes of arc. These tolerances are not merely impressive for the ancient world, they are impressive by any standard. Modern construction projects routinely achieve less precision than this. How was this precision achieved? The conventional answer invokes a combination of careful surveying techniques, the use of a merket, an ancient Egyptian alignment tool, and the observation of circumpolar stars to establish true north. These explanations are plausible. They are consistent with what we know about Egyptian astronomical knowledge, but they require a level of planning, coordination, and quality control that implies an organizational sophistication we rarely associate with ancient societies. Someone had to hold the vision of the finished structure in their mind across decades of construction. Someone had to ensure that the error introduced at the base did not compound as the structure rose. Someone had to understand, in a practical and precise way, the geometry of a structure that would take a generation to build and that would need to be right from the very first course of stone. Then, there is the question of the internal chambers and passages. The Great Pyramid contains 3 known chambers: the subterranean chamber cut into the bedrock below the pyramid, the so-called Queen's Chamber in the lower portion of the pyramid, and the King's Chamber in the upper portion, connected by the Grand Gallery, a corbelled passage 47 meters long and 8.5 meters tall that is one of the most remarkable architectural achievements of the ancient world. The King's Chamber is built entirely of red granite from Aswan, 900 kilometers to the south. The chamber measures 10.5 meters by 5.2 meters, with walls built from 100 granite blocks, each weighing approximately 25 tons. Above the chamber are 5 stress-relieving chambers separated by granite slabs weighing up to 70 tons each, designed to distribute the enormous weight of the pyramid above and protect the chamber from collapse. This is structural engineering of a sophistication that was not supposed to exist in 2560 BCE. The architects of the Great Pyramid understood load distribution. They understood how to protect an interior space from the crushing weight of millions of tons of stone above it. They understood, in other words, not just how to build big, but how to build smart. And then there is the orientation of the pyramid complex as a whole. In 1983, the Belgian engineer Robert Bouval noticed something that has since become one of the most discussed observations in the archaeology of ancient Egypt. The 3 pyramids of Giza, Khufu, Khafra, and Menkora are not perfectly aligned with each other. Khufu and Khafra are on a diagonal, and Menkora is offset to the east. But this offset pattern precisely mirrors the arrangement of the three belt stars of Orion, Alnitak, Alnilam, and Mintaka as they appeared in the Egyptian sky at a specific moment in time. The question is when. Because the position of stars in the night sky changes over time due to the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that traces a circle in the sky over a period of roughly 26,000 years. The belt stars of Orion were in the position that best matches the Giza layout, not in 2560 BCE, but around 10,500 BC, 8,000 years before the pyramids were supposedly built. Bauval's Orion correlation theory has been vigorously contested by mainstream Egyptologists, who point out that the match between the pyramid layout and the stellar positions is not exact, and that the theory requires assumptions about the ancient Egyptians' astronomical intentions that are not directly supported by textual evidence. These are fair criticisms, but the theory raises a question that the criticisms do not fully resolve. Why are the three pyramids arranged in a pattern that mirrors the belt of Orion at all? If the layout was determined by practical considerations of terrain and construction logistics, why does it happen to echo the arrangement of three of the most prominent stars in the Egyptian sky? The Egyptians were deeply invested in the relationship between earthly structures and celestial patterns. The pyramid texts, the oldest religious corpus in the world, are saturated with astronomical imagery. The pharaoh's journey after death is described in terms of the stars, specifically in terms of Orion, identified with Osiris, the god of resurrection. Perhaps the alignment is deliberate, but refers to the sky as it appeared during the construction period. Perhaps it is coincidental. Perhaps it encodes a memory, a reference to an older cosmological tradition, a tradition like the one we found at Nabta Playa that stretched back into the pre-dynastic period and carried astronomical knowledge across millennia of oral tradition before it was ever written down. The sky as a map, the earth as a mirror, the pyramid as the point where the two touch. The Great Sphinx adds another layer of complexity. The Sphinx is carved from the living rock of the Giza Plateau, its body that of a lion, its face traditionally identified as the Pharaoh Khafre. The conventional date for its construction is approximately 2500 BCE, contemporary with Khafre's pyramid. But in 1991, the geologist Robert Schoch of Boston University published an analysis of the weathering patterns on the Sphinx enclosure that suggested a different timeline. Schoch argued that the characteristic pattern of erosion visible on the walls of the Sphinx enclosure, deep vertical channels and rounded profiles, is consistent with prolonged exposure to heavy rainfall rather than the wind and sand erosion that would be expected if the structure had been built in 2500 BCE, when the Giza Plateau was already semi-arid. The kind of rainfall erosion Schoch described would require exposure to the wet climate that characterized northeastern Africa during the African humid period, which ended roughly 5,000 years ago. If Schoch is right, the Sphinx is older than the pyramids, much older, perhaps significantly older than 5,000 BCE. This would place its construction in a period before the unification of Egypt, before the first dynasties, in the deep prehistory of the Nile Valley, in the same era as Nabta Playa, as Karahan Tepe, as the Mustatils of Arabia. The Sphinx would not be a monument of the old kingdom. It would be a monument of a world so old that even the pharaohs, when they encountered it, may not have known who built it or why. The mainstream archaeological response to Schoch's analysis has been largely skeptical, pointing out that the erosion patterns could be explained by other mechanisms, including the periodic flooding of the Nile and the chemical weathering of the limestone. These alternative explanations are possible. The debate has not been resolved, but the pattern is worth noticing. At site after site, when we look carefully enough, we find evidence that the official timeline is incomplete, that the roots of what we call civilization extend deeper into the past than the textbooks acknowledge, that the people who came before the first cities, before writing, before agriculture, were not the simple, reactive, monument-free creatures that the conventional narrative describes. Now let us step back from the 7 sites and look at what they share, because what connects Karahan-Tepe and the Mustatils of Arabia and Nabta Playa and Caral and the Amazonian cities and Yonaguni and Giza is not a single civilization, not a single origin, not the lost continent of Atlantis or the intervention of ancient astronauts or any of the other sensationalist narratives that have attached themselves to these sites like barnacles to a hull. What connects them is something at once more modest and more profound. It is the evidence of a human capacity for complexity, for organization, for astronomical knowledge, for monumental building that appears much earlier and much more widely distributed in the human story than the official timeline has been willing to accommodate. The ancient astronaut hypothesis, which has been attached to many of these sites by popular media, deserves to be addressed directly because it is both understandable and deeply mistaken. It is understandable because when confronted with evidence of ancient precision and scale, the mind reaches for an explanation commensurate with the achievement. If these structures are so impressive, the reasoning goes, they must have required knowledge or technology beyond what ancient humans possessed. And if ancient humans didn't possess it, someone else must have provided it. But this reasoning contains a fundamental error. It underestimates ancient humans. It assumes that the cognitive and organizational capacities required to build Karahan-Tepe or align the pyramids to the stars were beyond the reach of people who lacked writing and metal tools. And the evidence, when you look at it carefully, does not support that assumption. The people who built Karahan-Tepe were anatomically modern humans with the same brains we have, the same capacity for abstract thought, for planning, for the accumulation and transmission of knowledge across generations. They lacked our technology, but they had something we sometimes undervalue: time, generations of careful observation, a relationship with the natural world, with the movements of stars and the behavior of animals and the properties of stone. That was direct and intimate and sustained in ways that our mediated, screen-filtered relationship with the world rarely is. What the ancient astronaut hypothesis does, in the end, is deny the achievement. It says, in effect, that ancient humans could not have done this. And the evidence says they could. They did. And they did it not because they were visited by beings from elsewhere, but because they were human beings, which is to say, they were creatures who build, who remember, who reach toward permanence, who carve faces into stone and align their monuments to the stars and bury their cattle with care and make dark earth from the forest floor and raise cities in the jungle. The real mystery is not how they did it. The real mystery is why so much of what they built was forgotten. And here we arrive at perhaps the deepest question that these 7 sites raise. Not a question about the past, but a question about the nature of historical memory itself. How does civilization forget? How does knowledge, accumulated over generations, carefully encoded in stone and text and oral tradition, simply disappear? The answer, when you look at the record, is that it happens more easily than we would like to think, and it happens in recognizable ways. Climate change is one mechanism. The Arabian humid period ended. The Saharan humid period ended. The monsoon retreated. The lakes dried. The grasslands became desert. The populations that had built the Mustatils and the stone circles of Nabta Playa dispersed, carrying fragments of their knowledge with them, but losing the context, the community, the landscape that gave that knowledge its meaning. When a civilization is dissolved by climate, it does not leave a record of its dissolution. It simply fades, leaving monuments that later peoples encounter without understanding, ruins that become quarries, alignments that become superstition. Disease is another mechanism. The Amazonian civilizations that the LiDAR surveys are now revealing were not destroyed by conquest in the first instance. They were destroyed by epidemic disease, spreading through trade networks ahead of the European colonizers, killing populations before any European eye had seen the cities they inhabited. The Spanish and Portuguese, who later explored the Amazon, encountered a landscape that looked empty and always had been, because the memory of what it had contained had died with the people who remembered it. War and deliberate erasure are a third mechanism. The Library of Alexandria is the most famous example, but it is one of thousands. The burning of the Maya codices by the Spanish bishop Diego de Landa in 1562 in a single afternoon destroyed the written records of a civilization that had been developing for more than 2,000 years. We have 4 surviving Maya codices, 4 from a civilization that produced hundreds, perhaps thousands. What knowledge died in that fire? What astronomical calculations? What historical records? What medical knowledge? What cosmological understanding? We do not know. We cannot know. The fire was thorough. And there is a fourth mechanism, perhaps the most insidious, the gradual replacement of one knowledge tradition by another, not through destruction, but through the slow accumulation of a new consensus about what is worth knowing and what is not. The Neolithic astronomical knowledge encoded at Nabta Playa was not burned. It was not conquered. It was simply superseded, first by the more elaborate astronomical traditions of dynastic Egypt, and then by the Greek and Roman astronomical frameworks that replaced them, and then by the medieval European cosmology that replaced those, and then by the scientific revolution that replaced everything that came before it. At each stage, some knowledge was preserved and some was lost, not because it was wrong, but because it was no longer legible within the new framework. We are, all of us, the inheritors of a partial record. The archive is incomplete. It has always been incomplete. The question is not whether knowledge has been lost. The question is how much and whether any of it can be recovered. The answer that these 7 sites suggest is more than we thought, and yes, some of it can. The LiDAR technology that revealed the Amazonian cities did not create those cities. It revealed them. They were always there, waiting beneath the canopy, preserved in the earthworks and the terra preta and the raised causeways that the forest had grown over, but not destroyed. The technology gave us new eyes. The cities gave those eyes something to see. The same is true of Karahan Tepe, which waited beneath the limestone ridge for 100 centuries, while the empires rose and fell above it. The same is true of the Mustatils, which were visible from the air for decades before anyone looked carefully enough to understand what they were. The same is true of the submerged landscapes of the continental shelves, which have been there since the Ice Age ended, waiting for the sonar and the diving technology and the willingness to look. The archive is not empty. It is not even particularly well hidden. It is simply waiting for the questions that will make it legible. And perhaps that is the most important thing that these 7 sites have in common. Not their age, not their precision, not their alignment to the stars or their distribution across the globe, but their patience. The patience of stone and earth and dark soil. The patience of things that were built to last, that were built by people who understood at some level that the world they inhabited was temporary, that the climate would change and the cities would fall and the knowledge would scatter, but that if they put it in stone, if they put it in the earth, if they aligned it to the stars that would still be there when everything else was gone, some part of it might survive. They were right. It survived. We are finding it. There is something in this that should settle the mind rather than disturb it. The evidence of these 7 sites is not evidence of a conspiracy or a cover-up, not evidence of a secret history deliberately suppressed by those in power, though there are certainly cases where inconvenient archaeological findings have been minimized or ignored for institutional reasons. It is evidence of something more fundamental. It is evidence that the human story is longer and stranger and more widely distributed than any single civilization has ever been able to fully comprehend. Every civilization that has ever existed has told itself a story about its own origins, a story in which it appears near the beginning, as the inheritor of a relatively simple past and the creator of a more complex future. The ancient Egyptians believed that their civilization had been founded by the gods in a primordial time they called Zep Tepi, the first time. The Sumerians believed that kingship had descended from heaven to the city of Eridu at the beginning of history. The Greeks believed that their civilization had emerged from a period of divine intervention and heroic age. Every culture, in some form, has a myth of origins that places the beginning of meaningful human history close to its own present. These myths are not lies. They are the inevitable product of a limited perspective. Every civilization can only see as far back as its own records reach, and its records reach back only as far as its own existence. What came before is, by definition, prehistory, which is to say, history that has not yet been recovered. We are living in an extraordinary moment in the recovery of prehistory. The tools available to archaeology in the 21st century, LIDAR, ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery, ancient DNA analysis, isotope studies, radiocarbon dating with increasing precision, are revealing a past that previous generations could not have accessed. And what that past is revealing, site by site, discovery by discovery, is that the official timeline is not wrong so much as it is incomplete, that the roots of human complexity extend deeper than we knew, that the impulse to build, to align, to remember, to carve a face into stone and look out across the millennia is not a product of civilization. It is the seed of it. Imagine standing on the limestone ridge at Karahan Tepe at night, 11,000 years ago. The Harran Plain stretches below you, silver in the moonlight, the seasonal wetlands gleaming where the rivers have spread across the flat ground. The hills are dark with forest. Somewhere in the distance, a sound carries on the wind. The bark of a fox, the call of a crane, something moving through the scrub below the ridge. And behind you, carved into the bedrock, the faces look out. Not at the landscape, not at the sky, at you, at whatever comes next. The person who carved that face did not know about Egypt, did not know about Mesopotamia, did not know about the cities and the empires and malls and the libraries and the wars that would come after. They knew the ridge and the plain and the stars and the animals and the feel of the limestone under a stone chisel and the way a face emerges from rock when you know where to look. They knew that something worth preserving was happening. They knew that the world they inhabited was rich and full and worthy of being remembered, and they put it in stone because stone lasts, because the face in stone will still be there when the person who carved it is dust, when the civilization that follows is dust, when the civilization after that is dust. And here we are, looking at the face, across 11,000 years of silence, across every empire and every catastrophe and every flood and every fire. The face is still there, still looking out, still waiting to be seen. The archive is patient. It has always been patient. And every night, in the quiet hours, when the noise of the day has faded and the mind is soft and open, it offers what it has preserved, not as answers, not as certainties, but as questions that are worth carrying into sleep. What did they know that we have forgotten? What are we building now that will last long enough for someone to find? What faces are we carving into the stone of our own time? And what will those faces say to the people who find them in the long silence that follows? These are not questions that need answers tonight. They are questions that can simply rest in the mind, the way a stone rests in the earth, holding its place quietly in the dark. You have travelled far tonight, through the limestone ridges of southeastern Turkey and the greened deserts of ancient Arabia, along the shores of a seasonal lake in the western desert of Egypt, where cattle herders watched the stars, down the river valleys of coastal Peru, where a city rose without pottery or writing or war, beneath the canopy of the Amazon, where the dark earth still holds the memory of cities the jungle swallowed, beneath the waters off the coast of Japan, where the stone terraces wait in the cold blue dark, and back to the plateau at Giza, where the three pyramids stand in their imperfect echo of Orion's belt, pointing at something older than themselves. 7 sites, 7 places where the stone remembers what the history books forgot. 7 windows into a human past that is longer and stranger and more capacious than any single civilization has been able to see. The art archive is never fully closed. There are always more files, always another ridge to survey, another floor of the ocean to map, another layer of jungle canopy to see through. The work continues season by season, site by site, question by question. If there is someone in your life who finds themselves awake in the small hours, turning questions over in the dark, someone who has always sensed that the official story was only part of the story, share this with them. Every time a file from the archive passes between two people, it creates something, a small ripple of curiosity that connects two seekers who may never meet, who may be on opposite sides of the world, under entirely different skies. That is how forgotten knowledge survives, not in libraries alone, but in the quiet act of one person saying to another, "I thought you might want to know this." And if sleep has left you tonight and you find yourself returning to these questions, let the video run again. The layers tend to reveal themselves differently in the second listening. The stones are patient enough for that, but for now, let the questions rest. Let the faces in the stone keep their vigil. Let the dark earth of the Amazon hold its memory. Let the stars that the builders of Nabta Playa watched move in their slow procession across the sky. You are somewhere in the world right now, in the dark, at some hour of the night, and the same stars are above you. The same stars that the cattle herders watched from the shore of the seasonal lake. The same stars that the builders of Karahan Tepe aligned their enclosures toward. The same stars that the pharaohs encoded in the geometry of the Giza Plateau. They have been there for every generation that has ever looked up. They will be there for every generation that follows. And somewhere in the long chain of looking, in the accumulated act of watching the sky and building toward it and carving the watching into stone, is something that connects every human being who has ever lived. That continuity is not a small thing. It is perhaps the largest thing. Wherever you are tonight, whatever brought you here to this quiet corner of the archive, let the weight of all that time settle gently over you. 11,000 years is a long time, but the human impulse that carved the face into the pillar at Karahan Tepe is the same impulse that brought you here tonight, to a story told in the dark about things that were built to last. The stones are patient, the archive is patient, and you can be patient too. Rest now. The questions will be here in the morning. The sights will be here. The faces in the stone will be here. They have waited this long. They will wait a little longer. Until next time, the archive remains open, the files remain unfolding, and the night shift continues. Somewhere in the dark, the clay remembers what we've forgotten, and maybe that is enough. The archive holds one more file that belongs beside this one. What if every flood myth, from Mesopotamia to the Americas to ancient India, is not mythology at all, but memory? The Big Flood paradox opens that question and follows it into some very deep water. It is waiting for you when you are ready.